Forta Foundation. Has anybody heard of Forta? No? Okay. Well, good. You'll learn a little bit about it today. We are the steward of the Forta Network. Forta Network's a decentralized network that sits on top of the 7 largest EVM chains, and we monitor on-chain activity for exploits, suspicious activity, anomalies, other things. We've been live for about a year. We're used by a lot of major DeFi protocols, exchanges, custodians, and end users. And the network's emitting millions of alerts a day at this point. The title of my talk is The Future of Threat Prevention in Web3. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to not only detect exploits, but also stop them once we detect them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So here's the 3 things we're going to cover. First, how Forta detects on-chain exploits. I'll kind of walk you through the anatomy of an exploit. Talk about how we detect things before they actually happen, before a loss occurs. Once we detect it, then the question becomes, can you prevent it? The short answer today is it's really difficult for protocol teams and bridges to stop an attack, even if we tell them about it in advance. But we think there are a number of alternatives that we'll start to see more out there in the ecosystem over the next year or 2. Okay, so how does Forta detect on-chain exploits? So most exploits map to these 4 stages. In Web 2, you would call this the kill chain. We don't use that term because it's confusing when you're talking about things in the context of a blockchain. But anyway, most smart contract exploits, bridge attacks, DeFi exploits will go through these 4 stages. So funding, preparation, exploitation, and then money laundering. Funding usually looks like this. I'm an attacker. I have funds already, but I don't want my attack to be linked to my wallet I use every day. So I'm going to obfuscate the source of my funds through Tornado Cash in advance. So you'll see money laundering through Tornado Cash or some other privacy-preserving protocol upfront. Once they've done that, they'll use those funds to then deploy and fund a new smart contract on chain. This is an attacker contract. This is the preparation stage. So this is setting up an attack. And then moving to exploitation, then they'll invoke that contract and steal funds, and then they'll do money laundering post-exploit as well. So the vast majority of hacks that exist, you can kind of map to this, these 4 stages here. So how does Forta detect things? So we're looking for activity across these 4 stages. And we're actually looking at, more specifically, we're looking at for patterns of activity across these 4 stages. So I just kind of walked through a really basic process an attacker will go through: Tornado Cash funding, new contract deployment, invoking, and then money laundering after the fact. So we have hundreds of bots that are running on the network that were built by us, built by other developers that are looking for individual signals in each of those stages. So there's a bot running on Forta that just looks at Tornado Cash withdrawal activity. There's another bot that just looks at new contract deployments. There's another bot that does nothing but analyze opcodes in new contracts that are deployed. There's another bot that simulates every contract that gets deployed across the 7 chains that we support. And they're constantly firing alerts. And we're looking for signals, or we're looking for patterns in those underlying alerts. So the goal is to detect an exploit in the preparation stage prior to a loss happening. So, and you'll see some of the signals that we're watching in those first 2 stages are listed there below. I know the font's a little small. Now, the challenge is that the farther you go to the right on these stages, the higher confidence you are that it's actually an attack. The challenge is that you have less time to actually prevent it as well, right? So it's a balance. So the sweet spot is the preparation stage. That's where you can get relatively high confidence alerts, and you still have a chance to either prevent something or mitigate it. So some learnings from year one at Forta. Most exploits are not atomic. I think that's a misconception. We actually can detect some exploits before a loss occurs. So these are the two good things in green. Unfortunately, even with advance warning, most protocols cannot prevent an attack. And that is because the only threat prevention mechanism teams have currently is a pause mechanism. And pause buttons are unfortunately far too slow to react. If you have, let's say, 5 minutes to respond to an alert, that's not enough time for most teams to sort of execute their kind of multisig signing process and pause a protocol, right? And this is not surprising because pause buttons were not created to, stop an imminent exploit, right? They were really meant to, one, decentralize control, and then respond to sort of code vulnerabilities where you had a little bit more time to address it. So if pause buttons are too slow, what other alternatives are out there? What else should teams be thinking about with respect to prevention mechanisms? So I'm going to run through a couple that we think are really interesting. So first one is asset segregation. DeFi protocols and bridges are effectively giant hot wallets. It's one of the reasons why you see hacks in such large dollar amounts in this ecosystem, because funds are pooled together. So the question becomes, can we segregate DeFi assets in a way that still preserves the user experience, but like maybe minimizes the attack surface a little bit better? And I think we can draw some inspiration here from how crypto exchanges manage their custody, right? Most centralized exchanges keep the vast majority of their assets in cold storage and just a minimal amount in hot wallets, right, to satisfy daily withdrawals, but everything else is offline. So there might be some inspiration we can draw there. Another thought is that we can impose withdrawal limits on protocols and bridges, right? Let's say a bridge that has $1 billion in TVL, you might only be able to withdraw 25% in any 24-hour period, right? So with something like that, you automatically kind of minimize your risk by 75%. And 99% of people that are using that bridge are probably not going to be impacted by that because very few people are moving large amounts of money. The last bullet here is interesting because there actually is a bridge team working on this today. And there'll probably be some more information published shortly about that. So I'm really excited about kind of asset segregation and withdrawal limits with respect to bridges in particular. Okay. Before I get to the next one, I heard a great analogy recently about a pause mechanism and sort of the inefficiency around it. And the comment was from the CTO at a large audit firm. And he said, pause buttons are effectively the equivalent of like shutting down a bank anytime the bank gets a suspicious transaction, right? Or a bad check is written. And when you think about it that way, pause buttons are clearly kind of a round peg trying to fit into a square hole here. The solution's not really fit for a purpose, right? Do we really want to shut down the bank every time there's a suspicious transaction? Probably not. So perhaps a better alternative is taking action not against the protocol itself, right, but taking action against like the malicious actor, the transaction. Now that you can detect it in advance, right? Can we screen that transaction? Can we screen that transaction out? This is how CeFi manages risk today, right? If you're a bank or a fintech, you don't shut down your business, your exchange, right? You pause or slow down the malicious transaction or the high-risk transaction until you can figure it out. This can technically be implemented at the base layer. You can implement it at the application layer. There's a bunch of different variations of this. But imagine a protocol being able to say, I want you to run all transactions with our protocol against these rules before they're processed and approved, right? You can apply negative and positive reputation, right? So you can let good things through, or you can slow bad things down. There are teams working on this today as well, which I think is really interesting. So transaction screening and asset segregation, I think, are two kind of exciting emerging threat prevention mechanisms that we'll see more of. Next one, time delays and simulation. So at Forta, we have talked about since the very beginning kind of the concept of a simulation network where, let's say there's a $10 million kind of flash loan transaction, right, from a brand new wallet address. I have no idea who that is. There's no reputation associated with it, and you can't discern the intent of that flash loan at first glance. So why don't we ask that person to sort of prove that that transaction is okay? So simulate it on a separate network first and run it on the current state and show us that there's no sort of malicious result, right? And then with that attestation, you can come back and you can run it on the main network. So I think there's a lot of simulation networks are really interesting. Technically, standing something up like this obviously requires a lot of effort, but I expect to see something like this as well. Okay, Frontrunning. This is probably one that some of you may be familiar with. You can monitor. Historically, you have been able to monitor the public mempool and detect exploit transactions before they're processed, pay a higher gas fee, and front run those transactions. BlockSec is a team that's been successful at this in the past, and this has been sort of an approach that white hat hackers have used to save funds. However, the proliferation of flash bots and other private mempools, L2s, et cetera, are giving teams like BlockSec and other white hats less visibility into pending transactions, and so we're not particularly excited about the kind of the future of front running. I think it has diminishing returns over time, and as visibility decreases, I think this is just going to get harder and harder to do. So we're not putting our eggs in this basket. Automated circuit breakers. So this is kind of like an automated version of a pause button. It's been talked about kind of ad nauseum after any large exploit. They work particularly well for stock exchanges. It's also possible in DeFi to set up an automated trigger, right? But there are risks in doing that. So any team that I think is thinking about doing this needs to be very thoughtful about how they implement it. One is you need to have a tolerance for false positives, right? So if you get an alert, if that alert's not 100% accurate all the time, then you may be pausing your protocol when you didn't need to, right? So there's a trade-off between being able to act fast and being accurate. Second is that it's subject to manipulation from competitors and hackers. So if your pause button triggers, or the conditions on which it will trigger, are public, and other people can see that, it means bad actors can also see that and manipulate it to their advantage and DDoS your system. And the impact from a pause can also be widespread. Stock exchanges are very kind of insulated, right? They can shut down without causing kind of a huge ripple effect. DeFi protocols sort of, but just because of composability and other integrations, you shut one thing down, it has a larger ripple effect. So you need to be very thoughtful about when and how you do that. Okay. A concept that's come up recently is transaction reversibility. So off-chain reversibility exists today. So this is a very manual process, right? But protocols will often negotiate with a hacker post-exploit to try and get those funds back. So I'll call that off-chain reversibility, right? And maybe they'll pay a bounty to that hacker, right? But there have been several proposals put forth recently to actually add reversibility features in ERC20 and 721 contracts. One proposal was from a research team at Stanford. I think the lossless team has also has functionality like this as well. So there's multiple teams that have thought about this and experimented with it. I think it's really interesting. It's perhaps a nice complement to some of these other things we're talking about. The challenge is that it assumes that a loss has still occurred, right? And you're sort of winding the clock back after the fact, which is it's an imperfect sort of solution and has its own complexities associated with it. Cyber insurance, this is not a prevention mechanism per se, right? But it's kind of a catch-all net after the fact. I think interestingly, I'll just call out the last bullet there. Things like asset segregation and transaction screening and time locks and simulation will lower can lower the risk profile of your protocol such that it's easier to get insurance, because for you to get insurance, someone else has to be willing to take the risk, right? And right now, the risk profile of protocols and bridges is extremely high, so therefore the appetite to underwrite that risk is very low. So we need to balance that out. Some alternatives here or some considerations here when you're thinking about these 7 alternatives I went through, and I'll leave you with this. Any team bridge that is thinking about threat detection, thinking about improving their pause button and experimenting with some of these other alternatives needs to think about what's the cost to the user if we do something different. Does it increase fees? Is there additional friction? Does it by slowing transactions down? Some of you might have had this thought, right? If we're screening things and slowing things down, what's the impact to the user experience there? Is that something that you can tolerate? Is that something your user base will tolerate? There are likely impacts on both composability and complexity. So those are things that need to be weighed. Decentralization, another key question. Who's responsible for making some of these decisions? Who's responsible for what's deemed high risk and what's not? Who's responsible for determining what's a potential exploit and what isn't, right? Risk of censorship. One of the biggest, I think, conversations around threat prevention is how involved does this community in general want to be when it comes to sort of the transaction processing flow and identifying things early on and perhaps filtering them out, right? Or even sort of flagging them as good or bad, right? So there's a lot of conversations that have been had and will continue to be had around that question. Effectiveness is obviously one of the big ones. Is it actually going to help? Can you prevent the attack? And then availability. Is the solution available today? Is this something that's going to be available in a couple months, more near term, or is it a long-term thing? All these are helpful when you're evaluating these alternatives. So that's it for me. If anyone's interested in learning more about Forta or continuing the discussion around threat prevention in Web3, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Telegram, and I'll be around here the rest of the week. Thank you.